So hello, it's nice to see you all here, and I'm happy to greet you all of you today in the name of the FemFest Mainz-Wiesbaden 2021 to this talk about policing and punishment in Germany. Kim and I, who organized this very exciting event tonight, we are very happy to introduce our expert speaker today, Mitali. So nice to have you here. Mitali is the founder and coordinator of the Justice Collective, a Berlin-based project that acts to end society's reliance on policing, punishment, and prisons. Also, she's the blueprint coordinator of Progressive International, an initiative that was built to unite, organize, and mobilize progressive forces around the world. And more than that, she's an attorney, and from 2016 to 2020, she was a co-lecturer, a researcher at Harvard Law School, and director of Criminal Justice Policy Program and its National Criminal Justice Debt Initiative. Furthermore, she was head of the European networks at Fair Trials from June 2020 to April 2021. And there she led a team to launch a campaign targeting racial injustices in Europe's criminal legal system. Mitali's research is focused on poverty, race, and punishment, as well as it includes Germany's state fine system and racial disparities in punishment in Europe. If you want to learn more about her work and her publications, check out the links in the chat that Kim just posted. So hello, Mitali. So good to have you here. Could you start off by sharing a bit more about what we'll talk about today? What do you ultimately hope we take away from the talk?
Yes, happy to. And so here is the agenda. What I want to do today is spend some time walking through in detail what policing and punishment looks like in Germany today. And the reason for that, in my view, is that over the last years, more people have come to activism against racist police violence and racial profiling. And as we take that work on, it's important to have a broader and deeper understanding of punitiveness in Germany. And so I will talk more broadly to talk about what the criminal legal system looks like, including the sentencing of low-level cases, imprisonment, but also the way in which there is a punitive approach to social policy in other parts of the government, including migration or in the provision of social benefits such as Hotspot. And as we kind of go through these different topics, I think we'll also see how sort of structurally punishment is pervasive, but also is also targeted at racialized groups, at migrants, at people experiencing poverty, and how there are intersectional impacts of punishment. And so this kind of account of the system, I think, serves a few purposes. One, I hope it helps people identify areas that they might want to act and intervene. And I think that the structural account also has implications for how we approach change. And so we'll talk a little bit about ideas of abolition. We'll also talk about what this understanding of punishment means for feminist movements who are trying to address the very real harms of gender-based violence.
So many people have likely joined today because racism and policing has received a lot more attention, especially after last year. Could you share your thoughts on our current moment? Why is it that these issues are more in the public discourse in Germany today?
In part, this is because of the Black Lives Matter protests. And in the summer of 2020, when they were at their peak, over 200,000 people came out across Germany. And what's interesting about those protests is that the organizers, who were mostly Black and Black feminists, were in part motivated by solidarity with the United States because of the murder of George Floyd. The protests were also very much grounded in a protest against Germany's denial of racism and a lack of willingness to engage on these issues. And so the messages of the protesters were around for example, the death of Uri Jallo in state custody, the murders in Hanau. And I think many people have also come out as these movements also introduce ideas of abolition and defunding the police. I also wanted to say, though, that part of why there were 200,000 people in the streets and why this moment crystallized is because there have been decades of anti-racist organizing and efforts to show the violence of the state. And so on this slide, I have just two examples. One is COP, which is a Berlin-based organization that's been around for 2 decades, that has been documenting racist police violence and police brutality and racial profiling. Also, I have there, not as visible perhaps, but the website of the International Women's Space, also in Berlin, that's been doing anti-racist, feminist self-organizing for a very long time. And so it's because of this ongoing work that I think we have this now moment we're in that feels different. And the hope is that we keep building from this place.
So could you explain abolition and what relevance it has in Germany?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think part of what's motivating people at this moment is also new ways of understanding what it is they're seeing as we understand racial profiling and racist police violence. And one such kind of new framework that people are more interested in is around abolition. So on the slide, I have a few definitions, but abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating punitive institutions such as the police, prisons, punishment, surveillance, and also punitive logics, and replacing them with lasting alternatives that are community-based, that actually prevent violence, that repair harm, that create real accountability. And abolition is about more than just tearing down buildings. It's about really shifting into that society we want, that's based on care and that has these alternatives in place that don't cause the harms that punishment does. And abolitionists really understand their analysis to be structural. And so what that means is that we're guided towards reforms that take power and resources away from the current punitive structures and that build new alternatives in their place. And that is in contrast with, and I think this is important, reforms that seek to hold current institutions accountable. For example, we might say, we think that when the police respond to a mental health emergency, that they often create more harm because the situation can escalate. The police aren't really equipped to deal with this. There's a kind of conflict relationship, and then this person who might be in crisis, rather than getting the type of attention they need, will instead get arrested or put in jail. And so the abolitionist response would not be, let's have a civilian oversight board so that when this type of thing happens, at least we can hold the police accountable later. They also wouldn't say, let's train these same police officers, because the understanding is that these institutions are just not structured to behave differently. But that instead we'd want to develop, as communities interested in this other approach, alternatives so that we can then take that power and responsibility from those current institutions and have this other way of approaching this. And people often ask if abolition is relevant outside of the United States. So I think most recently, the ideas have kind of come into the air through Black Lives Matter and this discussion in the United States. But so I have on the slide the title page of an article by Vanessa E. Thompson, who is a Black German scholar of abolition. And I should say, I think some of the reason that people wonder if abolition is relevant is because it can sometimes feel that that abolition is really about this American experience of having this history of slavery and of punishment being so bad, which it is. There are millions of people in jail and prison every night. That said, I want to walk through. So Vanessa would say abolition is relevant everywhere. I think that's what she would say. And she also notes that abolition isn't an American idea, that Black abolitionist radical thought can be traced to the Haitian Revolution. And in this piece, which I really recommend, it's quite accessible. She also writes a lot in German, so you can kind of explore her work. So in this piece, she goes through a few different analyses that then ultimately bring her to an abolitionist politics, or what she calls the politics of breathing. So one is that she talks about how experiences with police brutality and violence are widespread across the globe. And she points here to the uprisings across the world during COVID. So we're in this moment where we would expect governments to respond to this public health emergency with care, with health responses. And instead, there was also a lot of surveillance, ticketing, and often in ways that had intersectional impacts. And so she uses this as one example, but we can generally see that issues of racist police violence exist across Europe, in the United States, and also in the global South. And she also notes the kind of historical connections between policing today and the ways in which people were policed during colonialism. The second reason that she comes to an abolitionist politics in my reading is that she says that violence is normalized today in dominant society. And so here I'm going to read a direct quote. She says, "Violence represents a normalized and indeed everyday experience for many vulnerable and racialized groups, especially along the intersections of class, gender, sexuality, migrant status, and mental health." And so, for example, she talks about the 2001 murder of Nadea Mariam Zar, who was a Senegalese woman who was shot by the police in the home of her white German ex-boyfriend in Bavaria. And the third point that I wanted to share about sort of what brings us to an abolitionist politics, and what brings us to an abolitionist politics outside of the US is how Vanessa says, quote, "State violence is produced and affirmed not only by policing, but also by other state institutions and even non-state agents." And she references the courts, job centers, hospitals, schools, private security companies, and foster care. And so taken together, we can use the kind of abolitionist framework to set our aims at undoing these structures, in contrast to sort of the reform approach that I had described.
For the next part of the presentation, you will walk us through 4 aspects of punishment: policing, low-level punishment, prison, and other systems, including job centers and migration. After each mini section, we'll pause for clarification questions if the audience has some, and you can post them in the chat and we're going to read them. And then we will move on to the next part. In the end, we're going to have time for a longer discussion. So Mitali, back to you. Would you walk us back to you, and would you start us off talking about policing? Sorry.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so sorry, one sec. This is cool. So I want to talk about 3 ways that we police in Germany that all make it so that the people who are controlled by the police are racialized and migrantized communities and people. There are important topics around the kind of systemic problems of policing that I won't talk about in much detail, but contribute to this as well, including the presence of extreme right-wing people within these security agencies. So I'm going to start with racial profiling. So racial profiling is when the police use someone's assumed race or ethnicity as a criteria to stop them for a police control. Racial profiling is illegal under Article 3 of the Basic Law, which prohibits discrimination. It's also illegal under many of Germany's international and European commitments, including Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights. German courts have also regularly held racial profiling to be illegal, and in various contexts. So, for example, a 2016 case held racial profiling to be problematic, even in the context of border patrol. So a federal police officer was on the trains and was doing identification checks, purportedly to check whether people had the legal migration status, and used race as one factor in determining who to check on that train. And the court said that that was not okay. In a more recent case in 2018, police officers were patrolling a train station, and there they said they relied on essentially stereotypes of who committed offenses at this train station. So they said, you know, this group of people, they're the ones who are doing these crimes, and so we check this race of people. And here the court said that this was not okay, it could not be a factor, and specifically talked about how profiling in this way creates stigma and stereotypes, and that is its own harm. But despite this legal framework, we know that racial profiling happens in Germany every day. So I have on this slide the websites and Twitter accounts of 3 cop watch groups, among many in Germany. And these groups have spent years documenting examples of racial profiling. I have on the left top the website of COP, which is the Berlin-based organization I mentioned earlier. And they Hotspot Policing, which also is used in Germany, and is basically the idea that, when the police will designate a certain area in a city as a high crime area, and then that designation is used to direct police resources there. And so the police are then present in this area a lot. More importantly, or, you know, all the more important to this story is that the police then have additional powers under the law to stop people, and they don't need actual suspicion of a wrongdoing. And so in essence, designating these areas as high crime allows the police to circumvent the racial profiling laws that we just discussed. And it's probably no surprise that the areas that are designated as high crime tend to be in racialized communities, where racialized communities live and work and meet. And this designation can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more police are somewhere looking for offenses, they're likely to find something, and that something is used to justify all the more surveillance and control. The third tool works similarly. There's the construction of Criminalisation, which I'm sure many of you have heard on the news or in shows, TV shows. And I call this a construction because clan criminality in the US, the kind of equivalent is keeping gang databases, is that they are really often divorced from an empirical reality. And so instead large numbers of people, because of their family names, because of where they live and work, are targeted as potentially gang affiliated without any specific reason or suspicion. And that label is then used to justify increased surveillance, policing, and investigation, including at traffic stops or through the targeting of businesses that are considered likely to be gang related because there are businesses migrants or migrantized people run, such as shisha bars. So we in the equivalent kind of idea in the US is when basically any person who's had any contact with the police or might have some kind of criminal conviction, anyone that they're seen with when the police are patrolling, all of a sudden gets swept up into this gang database as potentially someone who's likely to commit an offense. And it kind of snowballs from there because, again, that's how police then make decisions about where to spend their time and who to police and for what. Just in closing, I want to say that the kind of ways of policing I've discussed are really about understanding how it is the police are making decisions about what crimes they're interested in and where they want to put their attention. And it's important to keep in mind that this profiling often leads to violence, that these police contacts can be violent, brutal, and even deadly. And so I wanted to just flag the work of Death in Custody. And here I have, again, the initiative for Uri Jallo as places to learn more about that, but also to keep the kind of, the stakes in mind, perhaps, yeah.
So thank you. So we know that racialized people are more likely to be policed. What criminal legal system consequences do they face because of these police encounters?
So I wanted to focus a bit on the punishment of low-level cases. This is also my area of expertise, and so I've spent, and I'll draw a lot from this research, over about 2 years ago, interviewed judges and prosecutors in 8 cities across Germany to understand how it is that they approach the sentencing of low-level cases. So what do I mean by low level? What are we talking about? So often when someone's stopped by the police, they're unlikely to face a very serious criminal case, right? They're unlikely to be accused of murder or a serious assault. More likely, and quite often, they will face some kind of criminal fine, or a low-level criminal case. So this is for offenses that are less serious. And the way that the German system punishes those is through a fine. And so every year in Germany, 550,000 fines are imposed. And this is separate from Ordnungswidrigkeiten, which is the administrative offenses, like a parking ticket. This would be in the criminal context. And in the last year for which we have data, of the 550,000 fines, 193,000 were imposed on non-Germans. So that's also a little, imprecise. We can't quite understand how many racialized people are in this number because the German government only keeps data according to citizenship. So we know that 193,000 were non-Germans, but we know less about the race and ethnicity details of who it is that's getting fined. But we have some indication, or we might have a hypothesis that racialized people are disproportionately targeted by criminal fining. And this next slide tells us what it is that people are fined for. And so I would draw our attention to the three categories that I've highlighted in red. Taken together, these three are what researchers would call crimes of poverty. So what we mean by that is that these are offenses where the underlying conduct has something to do with the person simply not having the resources. And so the first one in the list is simple theft. And simple theft, we can't know exactly what's underneath these cases in this data, but often involves people stealing basic life necessities and goods from the grocery store or from a Rossmann's or something like that. The second category, which also has 65-ish thousand offenses, is fraud. Fraud is incredibly broad again, and we can't know exactly what's happening in each of these cases. But what we do know is in there are people who are accused of a violation of the Hotspot regulations, and then also, in addition to facing a deduction in their Hotspot amounts, will have a criminal charge. And I'm going to talk about this in much more detail later. And then the third one in red highlight is the translated into English as the fraudulent acquisition of services. And these are usually cases of fare evasion. So this is when people ride public transportation and did not purchase a ticket. We also know that the vast majority of these 550,000 cases are just not very serious. The underlying conduct wasn't very serious. And the way we know that is because judges and prosecutors tell us that. So when a judge decides a case in Germany, they have to assign the case a number of units or a number of days of punishment. And that corresponds to the seriousness of the case. And as you can see in this chart, let's see, it's about 375,000 or so. The vast majority are, under 90 days of punishment. So that's 3 months, and many, so 186,000 are under 1 month of punishment. The problem, though, for people is that you potentially have a criminal charge. And then this diagram also shows you how high these fines end up being for people. So, for example, a criminal charge for not paying your subway ticket can be something like 20 days of punishment, 20 units. And the court will then try to calculate what your fine should be on that case. And they essentially take whatever amount of money you have in a month and divide it by 30. So they don't take expenses or anything out. And so if you are a recipient of Hotspot and you have something like 425 euro a month, they would, per unit would be 15 euro. So you could pay something like a 300 euro fine for failing to pay for a ticket on public transportation as someone who's receiving Hotspot. So this is incredibly harsh. I think the next thing we were going to do is move into talking about incarceration, unless there were questions at this stage. If not, I can keep moving. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat. Okay. So one problem with fines is that the amounts are incredibly high, and this can create a lot of harm in a person's life. So it can be a large source of stress. People may have to forego other needs to be able to pay this fine. And the reason for this, one of the main reasons for this acute stress is that if you don't pay a fine, you go to prison. And at no point in the German system is there a moment where the court would review the case and say, oh, actually, this person couldn't pay, and so they shouldn't go to prison. It's more or less the case that they assume that the original fine was affordable, and if you didn't pay, it's because you didn't want to, and you would go to prison. And so Germany has so when you look at the German prison population numbers, so if you were to just Google how many people are in prison every year, it's something like 58,000. But this number actually hides a lot of detail. So Germany counts the prison population on one day a year, and that is what's kind of reported. So on any given day, let's say there are approximately 58,000 people in prison. But what we don't see is the number of people going in and out. So there could have been many people who spent a month in prison, and we wouldn't sort of have a total sense. And so I say all of that to explain how every year 50,000 people are jailed for not paying their fines. So they're spending some amount of time in prison because they couldn't pay their fine, and then they are jailed for it. Sorry. And that number has, importantly, that number has doubled in the last 40 years. Which also means that 10% of all fines lead to prison in Germany. Here we can see the types of charges that people had that ultimately led to prison, or the state jailed them. And so this chart comes from a study by my colleague Nicole Bugelein. And we can see that property offenses and fare evasion feature prominently as the cases that people had where they then ultimately couldn't pay and went to prison. In another study also by Nicole, but in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, her and her co-authors also describe the circumstances of people who are then ending up in prison for not paying. It's the kind of intersectional harms that you might expect. So people were facing homelessness or were unemployed before they then went to prison. They were dealing with addiction and mental health issues. Also, many people had very many similar prior convictions and may even have spent some time in prison. And to me, what this says is that prison didn't solve the problems. I would now wanted to kind of touch on a few other aspects of incarceration. And here it looks like, okay, that's too bad. The chart isn't working on this slide for some reason, but I can talk us through it. So kind of to switch gears a little, so we talked a lot about fines, which is the vast majority of the criminal legal system, and then how not paying your fine can lead to incarceration. And so before kind of switching gears, I would talk about two other aspects of incarceration in Germany. And so the first is pretrial detention. So in 2020, 12,000 people, about 20% of the people in prison on this day where they measure were being held pretrial, which is also sometimes referred to as remand detention. It's basically when someone is put into prison before they have even been sentenced or found guilty of a crime. They're just waiting for their case to be heard. And a report 5 years ago talked about how 90% of all pre-trial detention cases in Germany were decided by the judge on the basis of a risk that the person wouldn't show up to their subsequent proceedings, so that there are many reasons that a court might hold someone, and this is the reason they use in 90% of the cases. And the reason that's interesting for us is because so yeah, one example is that recently a journalist, Ronan Steinke, tweeted about this, and he's been watching courts in Germany over the last years and said, quote, even a foreign origin and family in a foreign country is considered flight promoting, meaning that the court will then hold a person in pretrial. So essentially, if you're a racialized person, you're more likely to be held pending your court case. And it seems like, as I understand this journalist to understand it, and as the research shows, that it's because the courts are making assumptions that, you know, you have an uncle in another country and you'll just go there or something. Unfortunately, the data on this slide isn't showing, I'm not sure why, but the data also shows stark differences in the percentage of cases where there is a non-German involved, where the person gets held pretrial in comparison to Germans. And the difference is very much, had been increasing according to the most recent data, and is also seems to be driven by the large cities such as Berlin and Hamburg. This chart shows us the incarceration rates for women versus men in Germany. This is how the data is kept, and it shows a relatively straight line, so that the incarceration rates for women haven't really changed so much over time. The next slide shows us the rates with which women have received criminal convictions. And there we see a little more variation. So I think there'd be some questions where basically also at some point the rate for men of being sentenced drops quite significantly, and the drop for women isn't quite as significant. And so, yeah, just I wanted to say a few more things about kind of women and punishment. One kind of ongoing and large discussion is how so much of understanding women in getting punished and also their experiences in prison has been driven by stereotypes or a lack of attention, because the numbers are smaller because of various factors. And so there's a push now, I think, in Germany to do more research to understand this. And I wanted to share a few numbers. So the proportion of women suspected of offenses is increasing. There's been also a slight increase in the percentage of women going to prison, as well as women being sentenced to more serious offenses. And so I sort of flagged this saying I don't necessarily have all of the answers, but I think it might be worth paying attention to, especially, given these trends and the lack of attention. And so I would sort of close this part talking about prison, kind of noting the things I didn't have time to talk about. So one is looking more at the people who get sentenced to prison, looking more at the conditions of prisons and what that looks like for people, including for people who are transgender, and sort of, I think, and face a very difficult situation as the state tries to gender them into one or another prison. And also the issue of preventative detention. So at any given point, 5,000 people are held in Germany, not because they've been sentenced to a crime, not because they're there pre-trial, and not because they didn't pay a fine, but because often the state has decided that they are too dangerous for mental health reasons or something to leave prison, or that they have to be detained for this reason. But there are serious human rights concerns in these systems. So those are all additional things that I didn't have as much time to go into.
Okay, you'd explained at the outset that punishment isn't just in policing and the criminal legal system, but also can be found in other parts of the state. Can you explain what that means and walk us through an example?
Yeah, so I had 2 examples prepared, and I will just briefly mention the first and then walk through the second. Oh, actually back, yeah. So I'm sure many people are already familiar with the ways in which our migration systems look like carceral systems of punishment. And so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but people who are hoping to move to Germany to make a life here are held in prisons at the border. They're held in prisons before they're set to be deported. And they can actually face criminal sanctions as well. So the chart you see here is there's police data where police keep track of crimes that they're recording. And not all of these crimes turn into a criminal sanction, but you can see the tens of thousands of offenses that they're recording that really are migration status offenses. The example of kind of punitiveness outside of the formal criminal justice system that I wanted to spend a little more time talking about is punitiveness at the job center, and as people are asking for Hartz-IV. And I will also talk about how punishment in that system leads people to be punished in the criminal legal system. So having an actual criminal charge. And so what we'll see is how people end up with criminal cases quite often, and they have their benefits reduced quite often, and that's not because there's actually widespread fraud in these systems, but rather that criminalization is a tool of our shrinking welfare state. And so I want to kind of walk through the details of how, like, what happens and what this punishment and punitiveness looks like. And the idea is not to identify sort of procedural changes that we should make, but rather to paint a picture of how these systems are sort of meant to operate in this punitive way and structurally designed to do so. So this screenshot you see is an article that I thought had a very helpful summary written by a criminal defense lawyer of what these systems look like. And I've sort of supplemented that with my own research with these judges and prosecutors. So typically a case of benefits fraud arises when a person is said to have failed to report or update the government on a change that might be relevant to how much benefits they get or their eligibility. So maybe something like working an additional job or even changing who's living in their apartment and so on are things that they're supposed to update the job center about. But there are many, many such rules, and it can be very complicated and very strict. And then the job center is pretty proactive in trying to find fraud. And so they conduct financial audits, and those allow them to, they alert them to unreported income or interest income. The job center also often relies on anonymous communications from people who claim to be family members or friends of the person who's getting benefits, and sort of report that, like, the person is lying about X, Y, and Z. And as this article details, the job center doesn't ever look into whether these allegations are true. So they receive these anonymous communications, they don't look behind it, or it's flagged to them, let's say by some employment records, that maybe this person worked some extra hours that they shouldn't have, but that's never really verified. And they also they mostly assume fraud. So they don't assume a mistake, but they assume a willful attempt to lie to the job center. And importantly, they also often don't make sure that this discrepancy or this mistake or the difference between what they thought and what the person was saying was actually legally a problem. So it's not that every, discrepancy in reporting then becomes even a violation of the job center rules or fraud. But they don't always do this analysis. And so essentially a lot of things get swept up in fraud that may not have been any wrongdoing at all. And so, for example, in 2015, which is the last data I found, the job center reported 46,000 cases to prosecutors. And that would be in addition to people losing their benefits. And the additional problem is that once that file is with the public prosecutor, the situation isn't much better. So there's very little due process or fair procedure. The public prosecutor would get that file and most likely not really verify or check that information from the job center. They're going to just assume that these allegations of fraud are true and proceed accordingly. And these types of cases are not necessarily heard by a judge. So the way it works for these low-level fine cases is that the prosecutor makes a recommendation based on what the job center sent them, sends a file to the judge. The judge normally just agrees and signs off, and then the person would receive their judgment by mail and be told they had to pay whatever fine. And there would technically be an opportunity for this person to say, no, there was a mistake, but practically speaking, this doesn't happen. And so I've shown here again that same illustration about how high fines are. And then on the right side, this quotation from one of the judges I had interviewed, who's basically saying, but what's the big deal? I'm imposing so few units. It's just a slap on the wrist. It's just a small punishment. But we, of course, know that this can add up to quite a lot of money for people. And these benefits fraud prosecutions and the sanctions within the job system can fall more heavily on people who are racialized. It's obviously falling on people who are experiencing poverty. The article that I've been referring to talks about how one problem is when people have little knowledge of German and also aren't familiar with these very complicated rules. Germany also has a long history of trying to deny people benefits who are from other EU countries. So they rely on stereotypes to say that some people are coming here just to receive Germany's generous benefits. And actually, the European Court of Justice said that Germany could do that they could, if they felt that someone was coming here from another EU country and wasn't trying to integrate into the workforce, that those people could be denied benefits. I have on the slide here an initiative for the murder of Christy Schwindeck, who was a Black woman who was fatally shot by the police in a job center in Frankfurt in 2011 when she went to inquire about her unemployment benefits. And so kind of summing up, this account, again, wasn't to sort of show you procedural problems so that we can fix the procedural problems, but rather to showcase and highlight a system that's sort of built and maintains inequality and built to, and that targets racialized groups and people. Yeah.
So we have talked about punitiveness in Germany and the intersectional consequences. What does this mean for feminist movements and struggles? How can we think about addressing harms such as gender-based violence or sexual violence without falling back on punitive regimes? Especially since yesterday was the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, where many of us took to the streets probably. So that would be interesting to talk about.
Yeah. So so I had kind of started I think implying, and we've sort of talked through how, to me, this account of punishment shows the sort of pervasiveness and the ways in which we rely on punishment as social policy, or use punishment to support social policy that isn't doing exactly what people would want it to do. And I guess part of the implication there is that, and part of the, well, not implication, but the idea is that we want to, our activism should cut against these logics and cut against this inclination that punishment solves problems. But what I have also spoken less about are offenses that where there's a real harm and we need to have actual accountability and repair. And so that's obviously a concern and interest of feminist movements who are trying to demand accountability and so on for gender-based violence, and to create repair for gender-based violence. And so on the screen, I have just two examples of articles about the complicated, I think, dialogue that happened in Germany after Cologne, New Year's Eve, around carceral feminism, the sort of ways in which anti-racist and feminist movements were finding tensions in those responses. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I think many of you are probably familiar with or have access to those debates. And I think also you may already also be familiar with ideas of sort of restorative justice and transformative justice as other alternatives that are being explored in this space. So briefly, I think what I can do and add is speak a little bit to the kind of US history and example where the feminist movements of the 70s and 80s were very much what I think today is called carceral feminists, and how that's the thinking has kind of evolved and changed there. So in the 70s and 80s, violence against women became sort of the central focus of feminist movements in a way that wasn't the case necessarily before. And so this slide is a very excellent book, which I'm drawing from among some other sources that just came out, either this year or last year. And so the author talks about how before this point that actually feminist movements had a more, a kind of deeper connection to material needs, and that essentially a lot of that analysis around focusing on economic circumstances of women or increasing sort of power more holistically really became channeled into these demands around accountability for violence. And she details how the feminist movements at that time interacted with the growing victims' rights movements and tough on crime movements. And there was sort of a growing demand for ever harsher punishments for gender-based violence. And then the book has a really interesting account then of how Black feminists started to problematize this approach to gender-based violence. The author notes how poor Black women are more likely to face gender-based violence. So these were obviously issues that Black feminists were taking very seriously, but they raised a few concerns. So one is that, and the author talks about how, there was this hope or this kind of assumption that these laws, punishing gender-based violence were going to hold accountable the powerful, that we were going to finally be able to, the kind of cases we hear about, the Harvey Weinstein or something. But that in reality, day to day, it was poor Black men and other men of color who were in fact being arrested, charged, and sentenced. There's also a growing percentage of women being sentenced to gender-based violence. And the Black feminist movement started to talk about how increased policing and criminalization in communities that were already being criminalized and punished was taking a very heavy toll on these families and communities. They also talked about how it wasn't necessarily solving anything for the women themselves. So they kind of problematized how there were a lot of cultural or a lot of assumptions about what people wanted, and also, built into this what white feminist movement calling for punishment, that sort of assumed that a woman in this position wanted to leave and could do so, and so on and so forth. And so they talked about how arrest and criminalization didn't necessarily benefit Black women. And actually that's what research has shown, that the outcomes were not necessarily better for the women themselves. And so I suppose I'm not going to kind of close answering any questions, but sort of sharing this historical example and kind of noting that, probably for us, the challenge and the work is to build these alternatives moving forward. Yeah.
To close, would you like to close by sharing more about the Justice Collective?
Yeah, okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, so one thing I should say is that throughout the presentation, I tried to highlight many other groups who are working in this area, grassroots groups that have been around for a very long time. And I hope that people sort of find their way to them if they haven't already. But yes, first of all, thank you so much for having me. First of all, again, and yeah, I wanted to just share a tiny bit for people who may want to become involved. So I've started to build the Justice Collective over the last months with the goals of providing political education, developing campaigns, building coalitions, all to challenge punishment. And so there are kind of three areas of work. One is around punishment and inequalities. The second is around punishment and racism and racial disparities. And then a third is punishment in Europe. And it's kind of listed as its own category because I think so much work still needs to be done to sort of politicize and problematize these topics in Germany still. And so I'm working on a number of projects, one on the issue of public benefits in Germany as well as in the Netherlands, hoping to do some work against fare evasion, criminalization, and then also work around racism in the courts and fining and racial disparities in Germany and in Switzerland. So that's kind of a very quick overview preview, but would be happy for people to reach out.